Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for being here. My name is Danielle Moser, and I'm the Wildlife Program Manager for Oregon Wild. And if you don't know Oregon Wild, we're a state-based conservation organization that works to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And we've been doing it for over 50 years. So thanks for being here, and we're very excited about tonight's webcast. Eep. I can't even do it. My voice doesn't go that high. But if you don't know pikas, this eep sound will mean a lot after the presentation. But it's all about American pikas, and we're so excited to have Dr. Johanna Pika Jo Varner, as she's known, who is a pika biologist from Grand Junction, Colorado. During the school year, she teaches at Colorado Mesa University, but during the summer, she can be found in the mountains looking for pikas, placing temperate sensors in their habitats, and collecting scat samples to analyze for stress. During graduate school, she helped start the Cascade Pika Watch, which we're going to hear a lot about. And it's a participatory science program at the Oregon Zoo, and it continues to serve as its science advisor, and she continues to serve as its science advisor and training lead. And before she was a pika biologist, Dr. Varner was a biomedical engineer, a baker, and a blueberry farmer. She also dabbles in homebrewing from time to time. But she likes studying pikas best because they are adorable and live in beautiful places, and could not agree more. Oh, excuse me. I turned something off and now I can't. There we go. Advance my slides. Okay. So before I turn it over to Dr. Varner, I would like to take a moment to offer gratitude to the land itself and for those who've lived here in what is now known as Oregon since time immemorial. I would also like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land today. The history of tribes in Oregon is complex and nuanced and includes many colonial legacies and wrongdoings like forced removal that have had long lasting and current impacts. It's important to not only acknowledge Indigenous people and land, but continue to do meaningful work by supporting them in the present, respecting and uplifting tribal sovereignty, and taking action. Please visit our website for additional educational resources and ways to get engaged and support this important work being led by tribes around Oregon. If you're interested in watching this webcast again or want to share it with family and friends, which we encourage you to do, we will have a recording of this program, which will be emailed out, and it will also be posted on our website, oregonwild.org. So Dr. Varner will present, and then I will come in and do just a 5-minute quick presentation, one slide, connecting a recent legislative victory in Oregon to the pika talk in particular, and how that supports pikas. And then we'll get into the Q&A portion of the evening. So please, though, feel free to pop your questions in there because we tend to get a flood of questions right at the end. So the sooner you get them in, the easier it is for me to organize along the way. And then we'll, wrap up with the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and now you can, I think, share yours. So thank you so much, everyone.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Danielle, and thank you all for being here tonight to share an evening with me virtually to talk a little bit about pika research and about the Cascades Pika Watch project. Before I get started, I want to just sort of acknowledge that this project is definitely a team sport, and these folks in particular, Carrie, Haley, and Shervin, as well as Amanda and Stephen, have really helped to help begin and support and house and restart the Cascades Pika Watch program, as well as the Oregon Zoo for supporting and housing the program. And without their work and the support of the zoo, none of this would have happened, and we wouldn't be here talking with you today. Okay, so we're all here tonight, and you're part of this organization because Oregon has many wild and special places. And I would argue that one of the most special places in your state is in the Columbia River Gorge. As a biologist, I also came to love the gorge because of its unique natural history and rich biological diversity. And some of this incredible diversity is due to the number of ecological niches that are created by the extremes that we find in the gorge. Annual precipitation in the gorge drops from about 75 to 100 inches on the upper slopes of the West Cascades down to about 10 to 15 inches near the Dalles. And possibly nowhere else in the world can this rain shadow effect be seen so dramatically. And you can see that here in a satellite image of the area. So this kind of special habitat makes homes for special species. And another very special inhabitant of the Columbia River Gorge is the pika, which is, of course, what you all came here to hear about. So this is an outline of my talk tonight. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about the natural history of pikas and why they are potentially sensitive to environmental changes. Next, I'm going to tell you a few stories about how pikas are able to make a living in the Columbia River Gorge in this unique habitat. And finally, I'll tell you a little bit about the science that's been emerging from the Cascades Pika Watch project and how you can get more involved. So pikas are small mammals in the lagomorph order, and what that means is that they're related to rabbits and hares. They're also for scale about the size and shape of a russet potato, so your basic baked potato. And in a recent, very highly scientific survey, they were also voted to be the cutest mammal. So you can take it from me, I'm a scientist, and it's fact, pikas are the cutest. Interestingly, they're also the only lagomorph to call. And so I wanted to play for you a video of what their calls sound like. Okay, I can't see any of your faces, but I hope that you're all smiling. This, of course, is a joke. That's not what pikas sound like. And I wish that I could take some credit for this like amazing little piece of the internet, but unfortunately I can't. I am actually not sure who made that, but it is true. I did not lie to you that pikas are the only lagomorphs to call. So if you think about rabbits and hares, they actually don't make a lot of noise. But pikas are very vocal. They call to each other to warn each other of predators and also to defend and reinforce their territory. And their calls are really, really commensurately cute with how cute they are. And this is what they actually sound like. Okay, so pikas as a species have a sort of restricted distribution to high elevation talus. And when I use this word talus, I just really mean rock slides and boulder fields across Western North America. And you can see on this map, they're found basically as far south as northern New Mexico and parts of California, and then they're found into southern parts of Canada. And this distribution is thought to be limited by both a sensitivity to high temperatures and a limited ability to disperse between patches of habitats. Now, unlike many alpine mammals, pikas actually can't hibernate in the winter, and there's not a lot of food available when most of their habitat is under snow. And so the way that they deal with that is that most animals spend much of their summer amassing a food cache that will then sustain them through the winter. A single pika can actually collect about 28 kilograms or about 65 pounds of food. And this is a tremendous amount of summer activity, about 13,000 trips to the meadow and back. So the 65 pounds of food may not really sound like that much, but when you remember that pikas are the size of a potato, if we were to scale that into human terms, it would be like us collecting 5,000 pounds of food, making these same many trips to the grocery store, so 13,000 hay trips, and then in each trip carrying home the equivalent of 4 heads of lettuce in your mouth. So the next time that you're at the grocery store, I invite you to investigate the potatoes and then wander over to the heads of lettuce and imagine carrying 4 home in your mouth 13,000 times during the summer. And I think that will give you an appreciation for the amount of work that these animals have to put in every summer in order to make it through the winter. Now, recently, pikas have been gaining a bit of a reputation for being sensitive to climate change. And that is because many populations have been lost in response to climate change, particularly in the Great Basin. So this map actually shows you the results of resurveys of locations with historical records of pikas. The pikas were there about 100 years ago, and each dot represents a site where we have a historical record, and that's usually a museum specimen from like the early 1900s. The orange dots on this map basically represent about 40% of the locations are places that we've seen the pikas go locally extinct. And these extinct sites tended to have a warmer summer and a reduced winter snowpack, which has sort of supported the leading hypotheses about how climate change might affect pikas. Basically, if the temperatures get too high, the pikas are going to be unable to forage during the warm summers, and then they might not be able to get enough food. And this can be compounded by the fact that winter snowpack insulates against some of those harsh winter temperatures. So when you have a thick layer of snowpack, it actually acts as a blanket, like a blanket that insulates the ground. And if you were to measure the temperature in deep snowpack, as you may have done if you're interested in snow stability, you'll find that the temperatures at the bottom of the snowpack near the ground are consistently right at 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the temperature gets colder as you move to the surface. So ironically, that loss of winter snowpack actually results in colder winter temperatures in the talus where the pikas actually live. Now, given these constraints, we typically find pikas in places that look like this. This is a picture I took near Timberline on Mount Hood, and we find pikas on other Cascade volcanoes across the Pacific Northwest. And what you can see in this picture is that there are extensive talus patches and a large perimeter of alpine meadow vegetation as an ample food source. However, we also find pikas in some unusual places, in places that are basically predicted to be unsuitable based on what we know about their requirements for temperature and snowpack. And the Columbia River Gorge is just one such place. The summers are not short, and there's no persistent winter snowpack to protect the animals against cold temperatures and frequent freezing rain events. Now, just to drive home to you how special and unique this population is, this is a map that's showing you the minimum elevation at which pikas are found across their range. Yellow and orange colors basically indicate places where we see pikas increasing in elevation until the red places, which is basically unsuitable habitat. And so what you can see is that generally the elevation at which we find pikas increases as you go south and east in the continental United States. So they're found at much higher elevations where I live here in Southwest Colorado than they are where many of you are in the Pacific Northwest. But what you may have noticed by now is that this dark blue spot here is actually the Columbia River Gorge. So the gorge is literally the epicenter of the elevational distribution of the species, and it's the only place that we find pikas this low. So when I started my PhD program in 2010, we really knew very little about this population. There were literally like 2 papers published on this population that both basically said, pikas live here, but we don't really know how. And so when I arrived for my first season of fieldwork in 2011, which is now over 15 years ago, which is weird because I think I'm still 29, what we found was that the section of the gorge where we find pikas is characterized by this lush Douglas fir forest. And it's punctuated by these talus slopes that are home to pikas. And one of the most notable features that I thought when I first arrived at these sites was this thick layer of moss. In fact, that moss blanket can be about 6 inches or 15 centimeters thick in places, and it serves as a substrate for grasses, ferns, and flowers to grow right on the talus. And so this was really a central question for my dissertation work, was how do pikas survive in this atypical habitat? So I set out with a group of undergraduates, and we collectively recorded over 400 hours of behavioral observations of pikas living in the gorge. And we also placed out a network of temperature sensors to record the temperatures that the pikas actually experienced. So we placed sensors at the surface of, like, shielded from sunlight by rocks or moss, and then about a meter below the surface of the talus. And one of the most interesting things that we discovered was that pikas in the Columbia Gorge had a really unique diet. Actually, about 60% of their diet is moss. And in contrast, the typical food sources that this population, this species normally eats, these yellow and orange bars of grasses and flowers, represented less than 30% of their diet at both of these 2 sites where we conducted behavioral observations. And basically nobody eats moss. Moss is like the nutritional equivalent of a cardboard box. But moss is available year round. And so what that means is that the pikas at these sites are basically living in a hay pile that remains through the winter and doesn't require any effort during the summer to harvest. So to follow up on this observation, we actually collected a bunch of scat samples to analyze for gut microbes. And there's a growing body of literature that's demonstrating that this is really an important aspect of what plants herbivores can feed on. And in the lab, what we did was we actually extracted DNA and we sequenced that DNA to identify bacterial strains. And one of those strains that was really interesting was a group of bacteria that's called Melanobacteria. What you're looking at here on the y-axis is the percent of that melanobacteria in the gut microbiome of the pikas. And we collected samples in Oregon, and we broke those up based on pikas, whether pikas were at sites where they were consuming large amount of moss or more typical feeding, eating more grasses, flowers, and shrubs. And then we compared those to samples that we collected from other states and to other herbivores in the literature. And what we found is that this strain is actually super enriched in the moss-feeding pikas. There's actually 5 times more melanobacteria in the moss-feeding pikas of the Columbia River Gorge compared to pikas from other sites, and nearly 30 times the average reported for other herbivores in the literature. And this is really interesting because melanobacteria is actually a strain that can't be cultured, but it's been implicated in mammalian herbivores' ability to ferment fiber, suggesting that these gut microbes may give the gorge pikas a special superpower of being able to get enough nutrients and energy out of the moss that they eat. Another observation that we made during this time was that pikas in the gorge actually construct smaller hay piles than anywhere else in their range, if they even bother to at all. And so actually only about 1 in 4 animals even bothers to make a hay pile. And when they do, they're less than about 20% the mass of their high elevation counterparts on Mount Hood. Finally, we also looked at the temperatures in the rock slides where the pikas live. And to put this in perspective, I'm showing you a time trace of temperatures for a week in August in 2012. So what you're looking at here, this yellow line represents that time trace of temperatures that's measured at a sensor that represents the ambient temperature. So this is basically the temperature that you or I would experience if we were hiking through this habitat. So for context, 15 degrees Celsius, which are is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, are the overnight lows, and 35 degrees Celsius, which are kind of the daytime highs, is actually over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we found when we compared the temperatures during the same time at the same site to the temperatures that the pikas were actually experiencing down below the rocks is that the pikas were experiencing this very, very cool and very, very stable subtalus temperature. It was about 7 degrees Celsius all day, all night, which is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And the daily fluctuations in this habitat were frequently less than half a degree Fahrenheit. This also led to these instantaneous disparities with an ambient temperatures up to 31.5 degrees Celsius, which is among the biggest instantaneous disparities of any measured in any habitats. So to put this in perspective, this is basically like sitting in a refrigerator when it's 90 degrees outside, and it provides a better buffering from these ambient temperatures, even than many burrow systems tend to have. So coming back to this question about how do pikas persist in the Columbia River Gorge, what we found is that at least part of this story is that they're consuming an unusual food resource. And this is largely behavioral, but maybe with some special gut bacteria. Eating moss also appears to release them from making large hay piles since it's available all winter and requires no energy to harvest. In addition, pikas are able to avoid the hottest parts of the day and the year by seeking refuge in favorable microclimates. And importantly, they can afford this since their winter survival doesn't depend on a food cache. So here I'm going to switch gears a little bit and tell you a little bit about the Cascades Pika Watch program and basically how it started and how it's helped us to understand this special species following the Eagle Creek fire, which many of you guys may remember. So when I started working in Oregon in 2011, I got linked in with a big group that was interested in pikas in the gorge and like participatory science, which was led by David Shepardson at the Oregon Zoo. So I was actually there when this project came together. And Cascades Pika Watch started as a huge collaboration between scientists, educators, land managers, and conservationists, but it was housed in the Oregon Zoo. And we spent our first 5 years basically engaging volunteers in doing these opportunistic sitting surveys at a variety of sites where volunteers basically sit on a trail and record whether or not they see pikas. And the program was run out of the Oregon Zoo's education department with some of their volunteer management staff running the volunteer parts. However, that first changed in 2017 when the devastating Eagle Creek fire burned most of the pika's distribution in the Columbia River Gorge. And the Pika Watch group really sprung into action in order to apply for funding to take the lead on monitoring the recovery of the pika population in the aftermath of this fire. So together we set out to answer a few burning questions. I promise that's the first time I've ever made that joke. First, we were interested in how the fire affected habitat quality for pikas. And next, we were interested in whether that habitat quality effects might affect the distribution of pikas in this special habitat. And then finally, as sort of a meta question, we were interested in how we best engage volunteers in monitoring. And in particular, we were interested in this as a way of sustaining long-term interest in this project and in collecting quality post-fire monitoring data. So in 2018 and 2019, we actually received a 3-year grant from the Forest Service to train volunteers in transect surveys, which basically involved walking lines across the talus and searching for pika sign in the rocks. Volunteers also helped to survey the vegetation resources that were available to pikas at each site. And finally, some volunteers also helped with replacing temperature sensors that we had out before the fire. We actually gained special access to some closed areas of the gorge, which made it kind of a special experience. But these were pretty intensive surveys. And so we also continued the sitting surveys because they were a little bit more inclusive for volunteers who maybe didn't have the time or didn't feel comfortable walking across the talus. And in the sitting surveys, volunteers basically stay on the trails and watch and listen for pikas, but don't have to move around on the rocks. However, the sitting survey volunteers were limited to the open areas of the gorge, which, as some of you may remember, were pretty restricted still in 2018 and 2019. Now, unfortunately, like zoos across the country, the Oregon Zoo was hit hard by the pandemic. But in 2023, largely as a result of the efforts from Carrie, our volunteer coordinator, and the zoo's conservation manager, Shervin Hess, we were able to bring this project back in full force in 2023. So just to sort of show you how engagement in this program has changed through time. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this where something is like bad and then you think, it can't get worse, but then it does get worse. And then you think this must be the worst that it possibly can get. But then it like continues to get worse. Maybe that's just an experience that I've been having for the last few years. Pika Watch is like that, but opposite. So 2019 felt like a really big year where we trained almost 200 people, and that was amazing. And we were floored in 2023 that we had almost 1,000 people request access to training materials, and over 350 volunteers completed training, which like completely blew our previous huge seasons out of the water. And we thought we could never beat that, but then we did. And we've actually seen a continual increase in the number of volunteers requesting access to materials, and importantly, a real big growth in the percentage of people that have been trained and are submitting data. So in 2025, actually nearly 300 people submitted data to this project and conducted 683 surveys at 82 sites. And I noticed some names of volunteers on the list of folks who are attending today. So bravo, really bravo to all of you for that effort. A small humble brag about this project too before we get back to the science and the data. In case you missed it, Pika Watch hit the big screen and the streets of Portland last summer at the Portland Rose Festival Parade, where there was a pika the size of a grizzly bear on the Oregon Zoo's float. And I'm just going to play you a quick clip so that you can appreciate how cool this was.
Brought to life with natural materials and beautiful floral scents, Baby Tulatoo and Pika friends are welcoming visitors from all over the globe to visit the Rose City and the Oregon Zoo.
Okay, so that was pretty awesome. It was like kind of a high point. All right, so returning to the science here. First, basically, I want to share with you a few results about how the fire affected habitat quality for pikas. And I'll start by showing you how the habitat looked different after the fire. So here on the left, you can see this site, which is one of the ones where I had done diet and temperature recordings for my PhD. And you can see how it was changed after the fire in 2018. You can really see that a lot of the moss cover is burned, as well as the canopy of the forest in many places. And based on this image, it will surprise nobody that the aerial extent of moss cover was really significantly reduced. So here you're looking at the average moss coverage at 30 sites where we had moss coverage data from before the fire and that our Transect volunteers visited in 2018 and 2019. And you can see that less than half of the moss cover remained on average in the 2 years following the fire. When it came to the temperature data, what I can also tell you is that some of our surface sensors didn't survive the fire, which indicates that the surface temperatures where the moss cover burned was at least the melting point of this plastic. Other sensors literally exploded. I actually was picking up bits of microprocessors out of the rubble at several of my sites. I tried taking these to Onset Computing Corporation, but they weren't able to do anything with any of my of the lost data here, so unfortunately. But returning to the site where the surface sensor melted, luckily my sensor down in the talus was not melted. So we did actually measure temperatures in the talus during the Eagle Creek fire and during the fire at this particular site. So we know that the fire arrived at this site in the evening of September 14th, and while my sensor at the surface was melting, we did actually see a sharp increase in temperature to a whopping 7.5 degrees Celsius, which went up from about 40 degrees Fahrenheit to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I was actually able to recover my talus sensors at 2 other sites, and each one where the moss cover and the surface sensors burned, the talus temperatures kicked up by just a couple of degrees, but actually stayed remarkably cool. And this is in contrast to the time that I measured temperatures in the talus during a fire on Mount Hood in 2011, where the temperatures in the talus were pushing 20 degrees Celsius and the surface sensor didn't melt. So one more little bit of data about the Eagle Creek fire. Since I now have over 15 years of temperature data that were sort of interrupted by the fire, I decided to see if the fire altered microclimates relevant to pikas at this site and whether those microclimates have recovered in the last 8 years since the fire. This is actually work that I'm doing with 2 former students from my PhD work who now actually have gone on to get their own PhDs and are accomplished statisticians. So at this site that you're looking at in this picture, we actually calculated the average August temperature at the surface of this rock slide. And then also, at the surface of the rock slide, about a meter below the surface of the rock slide, and also the ambient temperature measured about 2 meters above the ground in the way that you or I would experience this, this habitat if we were hiking there. So here what you're looking at is a plot of that average temperature in August at this site across time from when we started in 2011 through last year in 2025. The black dots represent the temperature measured about that ambient temperature that you or I would experience. And this is sort of measured about 2 meters above the surface. The red dots then indicate the surface temperature that the pikas would experience when active on the rock slide, and the blue dots indicate the temperatures that are measured about 2 to 3 feet below the surface, which would be the pika's refuge from those surface temperatures. It's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but there's actually been a very significant warming trend in the ambient temperatures since the beginning of this study. The mean August temperature has risen at the site by about 2.5 degrees Celsius, which for context is about 10 times faster than the global average. And so that's another story that we're going to start looking into a little bit more here in the next year. One of the things you can see though here is that before the fire, the surface and the talus temperatures aren't really correlated with the ambient temperature, which is to say that they're not warmer in warm years, and there's not really any directional trend before the fire. Now we know that the fire burned this site in September of 2017, and I have data from August before the fire for the ambient temperature and the talus, but not for the surface because that was one of the sensors that melted, which means that we lost all the data that it had recorded before the fire as well. And we can look at the range of temperatures from before the fire for these pika-relevant microclimates. And what we can see here is that surface temperatures basically before the fire ranged between about 9 to 14 degrees Celsius, and the talus temperatures were about between 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. And there's a lot of variability here, probably due to how much precipitation we got in that month. But when we look at what happened in the 7 years following the fire, what we can see is that actually all of the talus temperatures are kind of within that range of temperatures that we saw from before the fire. And we had 2 years of data logger failure or loss here. But one of the things that really struck me when I looked at these data is that the surface temperatures are actually elevated by about 4 degrees Celsius from the range of what we saw before. You'll note that actually the ambient temperature is actually cooler in these 4 years after the fire right here. So this isn't simply driven by warmer summer temperatures in those years. More likely, I think it's because of the loss of moss and the loss of canopy cover. We saw the same pattern at a second site that had similar high moss cover and a severe burn where the surface sensor actually exploded. And we see these warmer temperatures in the 6 years following the fire. But what I think is even more interesting is what happened in 2023, where we see that these surface temperatures are starting to return back to a pre-fire normal, and that appears to be sustained in the last 2 years. So why are temperatures so much cooler at the surface in 2023 through 2025? Well, one hypothesis is that actually the vegetation cover at these sites might actually be recovering. And we can see vegetation cover on a large scale when we compare satellite images from Google Earth. Here you can see the burn scar right after the fire, but in the last 8 years since the fire, you can actually see that a lot of that burn scar has actually greened up, and it's much less like striking in the satellite images. We can see this change on the ground at our sites here too. So you can watch how this site at Wyeth has changed. It seems that green growth is actually starting to return to these sites, and there are now actually many, many more grasses and forbs than what we saw at this site before the fire. And some islands of vegetation are coming back on the rock slide, and the shrubs have also really filled in, which is providing important food for pikas. And we haven't really been systematically studying the moss cover, but we do have some opportunistic opportunities by comparing photos from the Cascades Pika Watch volunteer surveys. Now, when I started my PhD, the conventional wisdom was that the moss cover would be super, super slow to recover from disturbance, and that a disturbance of this magnitude, like this kind of fire, would require many decades for the moss cover to fully return. But last year, we actually saw something really interesting in the volunteer data. So I want you to pay special attention to this rock on the left here, the one that looks like it's got kind of a bite taken out of it. And what we saw when we looked at pictures that were taken, this was a picture taken by a Pika Watch volunteer in 2018 surveying the site. And when we looked at the picture of the same site taken by a volunteer surveying this site this year, what you can see is here's that same rock with that bite taken out of it, and there is a tremendous amount of moss recovery on this rock, like a really significant amount of moss recovery. And it's a little bit hard to tell the scale of these rocks, but they're actually really big. So here's me for scale. I'm 5'4" plus 2 inches of personality, and you can see that these rocks are like really large boulders. And so this is really a tremendous amount of moss recovery that has grown back in the last 8.5 years. So given the importance of moss in both mitigating the microclimate temperatures and as a diet, as a food source for pikas, I think this might also be part of what's driving that post-fire cooling trend, and also a cool application of the data that are coming from this program. All right, so given changes in the moss cover, we then turned to volunteer data on pika occupancy after the fire. And we ended up with these 30 sites where we had reliable data from pika occupancy surveys before the fire and which volunteers surveyed afterwards in 2018. What you can see is that we had 80% occupancy of these sites before the fire, but our volunteers found pikas at a lot fewer sites right after the fire. It seems like we lost pikas at about 10 sites, which was about a third of the sites where they used to be. But with that vegetation and moss cover recovery and the recovery of the microclimates, it seems like those pika populations may also be recovering. So last year, our volunteers found the most pikas ever since before the fire, and we're very close to pre-fire levels. And this could also suggest the hopeful possibility that this population may be fairly resilient to some of the changes that are coming down the pipe. I also just want to point out, this is a quick map of our sites that we surveyed in 2025 last summer. The pink sites are places where volunteers didn't detect pikas in any surveys. The teal sites are sites where volunteers detected pikas in at least one survey. And the size of the circle represents the number of surveys. So there was this site here, which is near Beacon Rock, received the most surveys, over 30 times that it was visited. And I just want to point out that these repeat visits also generate a really rich data set where we can look at issues of observer reliability and detectability. And this leads us into our last research question, where we were interested in understanding a little meta about how to best engage volunteers in monitoring. And one of the first steps here is trying to compare accuracy. But for that, you basically need a gold standard. And for that, we actually turned to a collaborator of mine named Eric Beaver. This is a picture of him photobombing my camera trap during my PhD. He's actually a serious scientist, but kind of a goofy dude. And we actually used his surveys as a gold standard. And what we did then was we calculated the sensitivity and the specificity of our volunteer surveys for both the transect surveys that volunteers did after the fire, and then those sitting surveys that we're doing now. So sensitivity and specificity, I think that sensitivity is basically the probability of detecting pikas if they're truly there. And think about this as basically detectability. Sometimes I think it's easier to think about this as like a test, like a COVID test that everybody's probably pretty familiar with. The sensitivity is basically if you have COVID, what's the probability that you will test positive? Or if the pikas are actually at a site, what's the probability that volunteers will detect them? The specificity then is the probability that a site is reported to be occupied by volunteers is actually occupied. So again, you can think about this like a positive COVID test. What's the probability that you actually have COVID if you test positive for it? So in terms of avoiding false negatives, except obviously we can agree that a positive COVID test is a bad thing and a pica occupied site is a good thing. What we found when we looked at this is that actually the specificity in both types of surveys was actually really quite high. What this means is that when volunteers say they found a pica, they most likely really did. And then we found that the sensitivity in the transect survey is a little bit higher than in the sitting survey, which means that their volunteers are a little bit more likely to miss pikas in a sitting survey than they are in these transect surveys. And this is not surprising since they're longer, more intensive, and people are moving around on the talus, so they might be more likely to elicit their calls from pikas. The single best predictor, though, of when volunteers missed pikas was actually sites with a low pica density. So what you're looking at here on the x-axis is the density of pikas, so the number of pikas that were detected by Eric Beaver in his surveys. And the y-axis is the proportion of volunteer surveys that represented a false negative. So basically the proportion of surveys where volunteers missed pikas. And what we can see here is that the false negative rate decreases as the pica density increases. What this means is that, and that's particularly the case for these sitting surveys, which are the orange dots compared to those transect surveys. So basically what this means is that when there were fewer than about one pica per 50-meter search effort, it's often really easy for volunteers to miss those pikas. And this could happen for a lot of reasons. It could be that the pikas, these lower density sites here on the left, are places that are hotter and drier. So the pikas may be more active at dawn and dusk and less active during the daylight when the volunteers are doing their surveys. In addition, the calls are used in social contexts, so it may be that pikas are less likely to talk to themselves if they're living at a low density, right? If you're in a big room by yourself, you might be less likely to try to talk to your neighbor than if you're in a crowded room where you're like right next to your neighbor. Some of these sites are also huge, like a football field or more, but pikas actually live in just a small area of the site. So it could be super dependent on where the volunteers happen to survey from as to whether pikas were in that area to detect at all. The other thing that we discovered in comparing these surveys was that longer surveys tended to be more accurate. So here what you're looking at is on the y-axis, the length of the survey, and these blue bars are surveys where volunteers reported no pikas. So this on the left is basically the true negatives, so sites that were truly unoccupied and volunteers did not detect pikas. And here on the right are the false negatives. These are basically sites where the volunteers missed the pikas that were actually there. And what we found is that volunteers who correctly identified unoccupied sites on average spent about 3 extra minutes than those who reported a false negative. And we found the same thing for the false positives. So the red bars are places where volunteers reported seeing a pica. These true positives are places that pikas were truly present at the site and the volunteers detected them. And these red bars represent false positives where somebody reported a pica sighting that we couldn't verify with a sound or a picture. And the volunteers who correctly identified true positives also spent longer than those who reported a false positive. So the difference here is a little bit subtle, but what it suggests is that spending an extra few minutes might have a big impact on accuracy. And this actually led us to adjust the length of our sitting survey time last year from 20 to 25 minutes. So we haven't had a chance yet to determine whether that improved accuracy last year, but that's on my list of things to do. And hopefully we'll have some answers about that soon. So just to sort of sum up this part of the talk, basically found that fire reduced the moss cover and increased the talus temperatures, and that the pica distribution was reduced after the fire, but then that occupancy did rebound to nearly pre-fire levels within about 6 years of the fire. And we're currently looking at other factors that might be affecting occupancy and starting to look at some of these patterns of abundance as well. And then finally, what we found is that multiple visits are really important, especially for these low density sites, and adjusting the survey duration will be even more important as we hope to involve volunteers in potentially monitoring populations that could be involved in population declines. So again, last year we updated our recommendation for how long volunteers should stay at each site before they move on. And we're looking into several other factors that might affect the ability of volunteers to detect picas. And this rich resurvey data set will really allow us to look at this very carefully. So I want to close the talk by just sharing with you a little bit more about how you can get involved in this project. Our in-person trainings are unfortunately closed for the season, but we do have an online training through Google Classroom that has unlimited capacity. And so you can join this year either by scanning this QR code, or if you miss the QR code, you can just go to oregonzoo.org/pica, or just Google Cascades Pica Watch and it'll get you there. The trainings in person, if you are really keen to join in person, you can do that next year when we do that again. They're really fun. They involve details of identifying picas, some survey protocols, going up site sign up and navigation, and some safety procedures. And then it's also an opportunity to meet the project leadership and eat snacks and meet cool people. But the online training, if you'd like to join us this year, covers all of the same topics, but it's self-paced and asynchronous. And it includes a bunch of YouTube videos that I produced during the pandemic, as well as a volunteer manual that gives you all of the instructions that you need. Following training, then you will receive an email that links you to all of the materials that you need to get started. We basically have our links centralized on a Google Doc with reminders, data submission pages, data sheets, frequently asked questions, and a bunch of information about site accessibility that Carrie has really taken a great care to put this together so that this project, basically anybody, if you want to survey picas, we have a site that will fit your needs and desires. And then we have these self-serve, automatically updating survey magic sheets that basically show you the sites that have been surveyed and then how many times they've been surveyed. So this is actually a screenshot of the status sheet, and you can see that actually some of our sites already this year in 2026 have been surveyed 10 or upwards of 10 times. So that's really awesome, and we're really stoked to see what volunteers find this year. Another really cool thing about this program that I want to highlight is the close ties that we have with the Gorge Commission, which is the primary agency making land use decisions in the Columbia River Gorge. They run a program called Vital Signs Indicators that help to monitor the ecological and natural resources in the gorge. They basically use to guide these decisions. And the PICA program data are actually being used as one of the 17 indicators in this program. There's no other PICA monitoring program that has nearly as close of a relationship with management as we do with the Gorge Commission. And I think this is one of the coolest things about this program and one of the things that makes it really, really special. Finally, PICA participatory science is also expanding, and in 2023, we helped to release a mobile app that invites anyone anywhere to upload photos and audios, in addition to some data about the picas that they observe. So this app, Pica Patrol, is actually available for free on all platforms. It's now available in Spanish, and it now includes a second species of pica, the collared pica, for collaborators in Alaska and northern Canada, where that species is found. Cascades Pica Watch has been having some friendly competition with the second best participatory science project for picas, which is the Colorado Pica Project. Just kidding, I work with them as well, and they are also great. But just to plug that if you're interested in this kind of work, and even if you don't live in the Columbia Gorge or close to Portland, this is a really great way for anybody across the state to be able to participate. All right, so I want to close out this talk with a few optimistic messages. And my intent isn't to minimize all the challenges of the world, but I feel like we could all use just a little bit of optimism or reasons for a hopeful outlook. And I think that these are a few of the important take-home messages that I hope I've convinced you of today. So first of all, hopefully you can appreciate from this talk the value of long-term studies like this one that help to provide an early warning signal of changes and also give us some insight into the drivers of those changes and help us to identify these important habitat features for management before catastrophic declines occur. In addition, I think that the pika's return after the Eagle Creek fires suggests that if we protect the right microrefugia, life will find a way to be able to bounce back, even after catastrophic events. And in addition, because some of the changes like pika distribution are hard to track, we need lots of eyes on the ground for population monitoring. And Cascades Pika Watch really demonstrates that the community can become essential scientific partners in this regard. And finally, I think it's just important to note that connection is really the foundation of conservation. So by participating in programs like Pika Watch, people can develop an intimacy with the landscape that can help turn hikers into stewards. And hope isn't something that just like happens to some people or that some people come by naturally. I think it's something that we can collectively build through collective action and shared discovery in programs like Pika Watch. So I always like to say to science is a team sport. More people that have been a part of this research than I can possibly fit on one slide. And in particular, a lot of the data that I showed you today was collected by my former students, JJ and Mallory, with funding from the Forest Service, NSF, and the Wilderness Society. And then Pika Watch is really a product of the hard work of myself, the Oregon Zoo, Shervin Hess, Carrie Springer, Haley Brazier, and Amanda Green-Voss. So thank you all for coming, dear humans. And with that, I think we have time for a couple of questions, but I definitely also want to leave time for Danielle to share the wildlife win.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And also, I was like, yes, yes, yes to your last slide. Like, and that is a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about very briefly. And I do promise we will get right into the questions, which we do have a few of them. So on that, and to what Dr. Pika Joe is saying, we do have a very important historic win for wildlife in Oregon. So we just want to take a moment to celebrate this, give you all an overview of what happened this year in the legislative session, and how it actually does relate to pikas. Despite some of this progress, and we're so excited to see it, they are still considered a species of greatest conservation need in Oregon. And this win for wildlife will hopefully and directly benefit them and many other at-risk species. So I only have one slide, but so the quick story is that we were successful in passing 1.25% for wildlife. If you haven't heard about it, I can talk about it for way beyond 5 minutes, but I will keep it brief. The legislation is House Bill 4134. And this essentially ensures that we have long-term dedicated funding in Oregon for wildlife habitat conservation, specifically those species that are most at risk. And the quick history on this is that, wildlife conservation funding, the model that was created in the 19th into the 20th century, I think probably more the 20th century, but was that, fees and funds that were raised through hunting and fishing, fees, permits, excise taxes, is what funded Fish and Wildlife, the agencies and the programs and the work on the ground. And because of that funding model, if you're going out and buying an elk hunting tag, typically that money then would feed right back into elk needs and habitat and more opportunities for hunting, which isn't bad. But the problem is that most of the species in Oregon are not hunted and fished. And so when we created this model, it just left out a lot of species that are considered non-game. And so for Oregon, this has been a problem that's plagued us. And to be honest, trying to get funding through sort of the general fund, through your personal income tax and your property taxes that all go to the government, has been really tough. It's hard to compete with housing and education and healthcare, and the list goes on and on. And so this kind of always fell down the list of priorities for legislators. And so it was really clear that we needed its own funding source. Um, and unfortunately, the intensifying extinction crisis and biodiversity loss really put this front and center. Hey, Oregon, we need to step up to the plate. We need to solve this sooner than later, because if these species go extinct, that's it. And so I'm happy to report, though, and it was many years in the making, definitely with the culmination of 2026, but we passed this legislation. And so this funding will come from an increase in the state lodging tax, which is a tax you pay and visitors pay when they stay at a hotel or Airbnb or camping. And Oregon's is 1.5%. And so we increased it to 2.75, or namely up 1.25%, with those increased funds going directly to wildlife and conservation and habitat restoration. And, for us, it made a lot of sense, and those advocates that supported this, because this is what drives tourism in Oregon. People are coming here to see wildlife, to be in nature. Even Pica Joe's coming from Colorado to be here because it's so wonderful, but we need to invest in that and support that. So again, I could go on and on, but we're looking at 75 million a biennium directly for imperiled species recovery. And for things like Pica Joe said, it's collecting data so we actually know how our species doing, and what are the restoration actions and recovery actions we need to be taking. Working with partners like the Oregon Zoo, like Think Wild in Central Oregon, on helping people live more harmoniously with wildlife. There's a lot of more conflict between humans and wildlife. And so the list goes on and on and on. Like I said, I could talk for hours, but this is a very significant victory. And because those are very few and far between, we wanted to take a moment to just celebrate that, let you all know about it, and feel free to reach out and ask me all the questions you have. But with that, let's get to questions for Dr. Pica Joe. So first of all, I loved this comment because I had the exact same reaction when you said, "Oh, I must still think I'm 29." Somebody wrote in the comments, "We all think we're 29," and I feel that in my bones. I always still think I'm 29. Okay, so we have a lot of questions about picas, reproduction, offspring. So when do picas give birth? How many offspring do they typically have? So if you could speak a little bit more, maybe just to the general biology.
Yeah, so the lifespan of a pica is actually a question that is still kind of unknown. During the summer, I also run a project closer to home here in the La Salle Mountains of southeastern Utah, which, if you've ever seen pictures of like the Red Rock Desert of Utah with the big arches, and there's these mountains behind the arches, it's those mountains. And they're really unique because they're pretty far south and they're super isolated in this like ocean of Red Rock Desert. Which is a bit of an oxymoron, but still, where we're actually trapping and tagging the picas, looking at their lifespan. And what we found is that about half of the picas survive more than a couple of years, more than like a year to two at least. And a few of them actually can survive 6 or 7 years. Like I've had some animals that are like 6 or 7 years old, which, for something the size of a potato is like pretty long. However, some of my collaborators tell me that in places where they used to be able to monitor picas and used to see them regularly live that long, they're seeing their lifespans kind of not be as long anymore. And so that could be kind of one of those like super early signals of some potential problems. And I think also kind of points back to the value of those long-term data sets. As far as how many offspring they usually have two babies in the spring. They time the birth to be when basically when the snow melts, so that there's food available for mom when she's nursing the babies. Their baby picas, when they emerge and come out on the surface of the talus, are like the size of a red potato. And the only thing cuter than a pica is a baby pica. And then mom tolerates them in her territory until about August, and then she kicks them out like really seriously, like, you seriously have to get out of here and go like find your own home and get your own job. So anybody who is listening who's still living at home with their parents, you can be glad that you are not a baby pica getting kicked out at about the age of 12 to go forage for yourself and get a job.
Yeah. How long's the gestation period? Do you know?
I don't know for sure, but I would guess it's a couple of months. They usually mate under the snow and then they gestate and then they birth the babies when the snow melts.
How romantic.
I know. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Are the gorge pikas genetically different than pikas in other areas then? Sounds like
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
We haven't really studied that very
Okay.
carefully, partly because I tried to actually catch the pikas in the gorge during my PhD, mostly to be able to mark them with tags and be able to track their survival. And I was very, very unsuccessful. I trapped a lot of banana slugs, and I trapped a lot of mice in my car, and I trapped very few pikas. And so we don't actually have a very good genetics data set for them yet. But I think there are some people who are going to start looking at that
Yeah.
through DNA that you can get out of scat now, that those techniques have gotten a lot better in the last few.
Right. Let's see. Let- Okay, since gorge pikas live at a much lower elevation, are their predators different than their higher elevation relatives?
Yeah, at the high elevation sites, the weasels are usually the primary predator because they're like a little electric sausages. They can like follow the pikas through the rocks. But I think that there's not nearly as many weasels at lower elevations as there are at higher elevations. So I would expect that their predators would be different, probably more hawks and foxes, and fewer weasels.
Yeah. Trying to go a little out of order. So, have you noticed whether repeated surveys and human presence at a site have any impact on pika behavior?
Yeah, that's a really good question,
Mhm.
because obviously we have a lot of volunteers going to these sites. And basically, the short answer is no. Pikas are pretty, like, they habituate pretty quickly to people on the trail as long as you're not like chasing them or like throwing rocks or letting your dog chase them or something. If you're just sitting on the trail or standing on the trail and watching, they pretty quickly get used to you and just kind of go back to doing their business.
Yeah.
And that's what we found also, when we were doing those behavioral surveys. The other thing is that in the gorge, there's just a lot of human presence on the trails
Yeah.
because it's a very popular hiking
Mhm.
area. And so the presence of volunteers are not like super changing the number
Yeah.
of humans. And that population, I think, is pretty habituated.
Gotcha. Oh, this is a great one. I'm 12 years old. Okay, well, this is the person, obviously. I'm 12 years old and want to be a wildlife conservationist when I grow up. What would you recommend I do to help work towards that besides joining the Pika Watch? Because I'm going to do that this summer.
Yeah, I love that. And I just love that you're here, learning about pikas. I think what I would recommend is, yeah, get involved in projects like this. There are lots of um, apprenticeship like programs, like the zoo has different ways that
Mhm.
young people can volunteer to get involved in conservation if you live near the Oregon Zoo or a different zoo or a different science center. And then, work hard in math and science classes in high school and study, you can potentially pursue a biology degree. A lot of universities have connections with other organizations where you can actually do an internship, and just like getting some experience and getting your foot in the door through some of those internship opportunities or volunteer opportunities, is really a great way to gain some experience. The most important piece of advice that I have is that like different aspects of wildlife conservation are for different people. And so
Yeah.
you may discover that like you don't love field work or that you do love field work. And even if you get turned off by one aspect of the
Mhm.
job, like don't let that turn you away from a career in it, because there are lots of different ways that people contribute to wildlife conservation, and learning what you don't like is as important, if not more important, than learning what you do like, so that you can kind of make choices to maximize the things that you like.
Yeah, and I would even add, I mean, if wildlife conservationist to me expands beyond even scientist. I mean, I am maybe a case in point. I love science and respect it, but that was not my path. And, I'm a wildlife advocate and I got a degree in political science and went more the policy and law route, which we also need if you want to work in conservation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or you can go in the storytelling route, right? Like a lot of
Yeah.
people get degrees in communications or in film and help to tell the stories of the wildlife. And again, sort of like I was talking about, people don't value what they don't know about. And so the more you
Mhm.
can help like people understand local, ecosystems or wildlife or conservation efforts that are needed, that's a really important part of that too. So
For
that's a really
sure.
good point, Danielle.
Yeah. I just want to, so it's 7:01, but we're going to hang on for 2 to 3 more minutes. We've got a couple more questions. So if you can hang with us, great. Okay, so we have two different ones, but of the same variety, wanting to know if you or others are collecting pica data in like Central Oregon and South Cascades and just like in general, and if so, how are they doing? How's that population doing?
Yeah, we did pilot an expansion to Central Oregon last summer, and I don't know whether or not that is going to be able to happen again, mostly because of the capacity of the organizations that we partnered with. So there probably isn't a like Pica Watch program per se in Central Oregon or South Oregon right now, but you can definitely use the app. Tell us about just go hiking and report pica sightings through the app, and you can tag Cascades Pica Watch in your app observations, and then that will help us to be able to see sort of where they are in that area and help us to potentially identify new sites if we're able to restart that. Pica Watch does have one site closer to Central Oregon, but we don't have very many down there yet. As far as how that population is doing, I am not totally sure, but like there's some picas that live in these like weird lava habitats in Central Oregon, and they're like the detectability is really, really different. So that sensitivity and specificity that I was talking about is like super, super different. And so we're trying to figure out how to deal with that too, because those picas are kind of like ghosts. Like they're there, but like you don't see them or hear them or find them.
Oh, you don't even hear them. That's the best part.
Right. Yeah.
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 Okay, another question. How steady is the temperature under the talus at much higher elevation? Shouldn't it be at least as cool?
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting and surprising things I think that we found in my PhD research is that actually the temperatures in the low elevations in the gorge were actually cooler and more stable than they were at the higher elevations of Mount Hood. So
Wow.
in Mount Hood, you can basically start finding picas at about like I don't know, 4,000 feet elevation, and then they go all the way up to timberline, at maybe like 8,000 feet or, and above timberline. And the temperatures definitely get cooler as you go up the mountain. But when you come down, actually down into the gorge, the temperatures are even cooler in the gorge than they are at the highest sites that we've worked on Mount Hood. So yes, they are cool and nice there, but they're not as nice as in the gorge.
Interesting. I feel like I was looking at your shirt. I feel like you should do one for the gorge, and it's like either the pika saying it or it's underneath and it says like fueled by moss or moss powered or something like to be
Yeah.
really cool. Just I think that was such a fascinating part of your presentation was just
Yeah.
about moss, and I loved
Yeah.
like for us if we were eating cardboard. I mean, yeah, but moss is incredibly important as we know
Yeah.
in the
Yeah. Exactly.
okay, I think I've got two more. Oh, this is an important one. Here we go. Is it pica or pika?
It's pika. It's
It's
pika,
pica.
but pikas are the inspiration for Pikachu, which, as I understand it, is both an animal that represents a cross between a pika and a lightning bolt, and Pikachu is also like a onomatopoeia of the sound that lightning makes in Japan, in Japanese.
Oh,
So,
gosh.
so it has
Wow.
like a lot of layers there. But yeah, pika.
That's funny because there was a whole Oregon Wild debate of whether it was snowy plover or plover, and that like broke up the whole staff to
Yeah,
know is it which one is it. So
yeah,
I thought that was a little bit more decisive.
yeah, yeah.
Um, okay, let's see. One more. Oh, somebody said they liked the Cascade Pika fueled my boss. Have you considered partnering with an organization such as the Washington Trails Association? Many people use their site and app for finding hike information. It would be cool to see an indicator on hikes that feature pika. Or iNaturalist. I was going to ask that too, because I think that's another way the Department of Fish and Wildlife has been also doing some of that citizen science collection.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Those are really great ideas. And I think our volunteer coordinator, Carrie, is here tonight listening in. And, maybe that's a great idea of something that we could follow up on
That's
is,
great.
some of these organizations that have information about hikes and, that we might be able to have people join. We've also definitely considered, we have been working with a designer who has been making some like promotional posters and materials that could be posted very easily or shared to advertise the app and how it works. And so
That's great.
that's definitely something that we're working on.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, this is really the last one, and then we're going to wrap up. What is the plural for pica?
It's pikas.
It
A
is
lot of
picas.
people
Okay.
use the word pica as the plural for pikas, but pica biologists all use pikas.
Picas.
So see you
Great.
at Picas.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. Thank you
Yeah,
for both grammar, lessons and biology and
absolutely.
ecology is great. Thank you for your time and for all this work. And we're excited to hear about it. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us.
A great pleasure for me. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. And thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Enjoy the spring. Goodbye.